Hello, and welcome to Women Leaders in Cybersecurity, Critical Cybersecurity Updates. I'm Judy Germano, the host for today, and thrilled to be here. As part of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity, we have been doing the Women Leaders in Cybersecurity program series for the last 6 years now. In olden days, it was in person at NYU School of Law, and but the last couple of years, we've been by webinar, which unfortunately we don't get to be in the room with all of you, but the benefit is that we have enjoyed a national and even international audience for these important talks. Today, we have another amazing lineup of women who are true leaders, thought leaders, and governance leaders and legal leaders in the field who are sharing with us some key issues that are pressing today, including the continuing rise in ransomware attacks, attacks from state actors, attacks on critical infrastructure, and supply chain attacks. Here we are, we're just about the 1-year anniversary of the SolarWinds attack, and the landscape has only gotten more and more challenging for cybersecurity professionals. But thankfully today we have some great folks to help us make sure we're asking the right questions, thinking about these critical issues in the right ways, and doing what we can to prepare for, prevent, and properly respond to those threats. But without further ado, our first speaker today, we have a terrific person from the U.S. Department of Justice. We are thrilled to have her joining us here today. Eun-Young Choi is Senior Counsel of Cyber to the Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice. Previously, she was a cybercrime coordinator at the U.S. Attorney's Office and for the Southern District of New York, and has been an associate at a law firm in private practice, clerked for judges in the district and circuit court. And we are thrilled to have you with us here today. Eun-Young, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Judy, for having me. I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you. So one of the issues we have in cybersecurity is figuring out who in government does what. Can you help us out a little bit?
I can totally understand that challenge. From my previous vantage point being a cyber prosecutor, I had no idea. I understood that there were other people involved. I had no sort of concrete understanding of what all the different roles are. And so I'm happy to take that question. I think it's an important one. To begin, there are some, presidential memoranda and policy directives that sort of explain the overall structure of how the government is supposed to deal with cyber issues. Sort of at a most basic level, I would say there are 3 lead agencies that are involved in certain aspects of the cyber threat. The first, from our perspective, is threat response activities, given the nation state actors and the national security nexus that's involved with a lot of these cyber incidents. And from that perspective, the Department of Justice, acting through both the Federal Bureau of Investigation as well as the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which you may have heard of, NCIJTF. They're the lead agency with regard to threat response. Second, and importantly, an agency that we work very closely with is DHS, acting through CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So they are the leads for asset response activities, making sure that not only the government assets, but also writ large in the private sector, that we're doing the best we can in terms of resilience and ensuring that we can be well positioned to deal with emerging threats. And so we work very closely with CISA, both when large-scale incidents occur, but generally to make sure that when we are developing information over the course of investigations or dealing with victims, we're working lockstep with CISA so that we can work on things like jointly branded products to get out to the private sector so they can see what the emerging trends are and what sort of the TTPs are, things that that malicious actors are doing, and sort of threats and trends that we're seeing. And third, and importantly, we have the intelligence community. I would say, generally speaking, ODNI takes the lead here for intelligence support and related activities. So we have a variety of other agencies that we work with within the IC. Obviously, there are entities such as the NSA and Cybercom who are really dealing with both intel gathering and offensive actions that can be taken with regard to things that are of interest from a national security perspective. Obviously, DoD has a particular concern about these things because they need to make sure that that the DIB is well protected. And so each of these sort of main three categories of entities are the ones that are, I would say, are the lead. But aside from that, there's also a plethora of other entities. Obviously, there are sector risk management agencies. So there, for every critical infrastructure sector, there is an agency that takes lead dealing with cybersecurity issues there, as well as our partnerships with Treasury and State, because we understand that cyber is a multifaceted threat that we have to deal with international partners, that we have to deal with its impacts on the financial structure and sector. So we work with all of these agencies sort of writ large, and it's a concerted effort, oftentimes from a policy perspective, led by the National Security Council and their Pound Cyber, their cyber team there.
Thank you. So practically speaking, when someone is a victim, a company, an entity is victim of a security threat, who do they call in government? We have lawyers, of course, they call your lawyer first, but who in government should they be calling?
So, our view is you should not worry about who in government you should call, in the sense that if you call one member of government, we will be able to make sure that we're well coordinated and that information goes to the people that need to have it. So, I would say from our perspective, it's very important for you to reach out to the department and to law enforcement. Part of that is because entities such as the FBI, they have 56 field offices throughout the United States. They're the ones who could have, when a victim makes a notification, the FBI, we can make sure that we can deploy agents to help with their unique expertise and ensure that we can try to understand the threat writ large and gather information that would help our investigations, not only from a perspective of furthering our own criminal prosecutions, but as has been recently shown in the examples of Colonial Pipeline and some other seizures that have been made public with regard to cryptocurrency payments in the ransomware context. Oftentimes we can do things and have actions that we can take to try to make victims whole and minimize the harm to victims, because I think, and this is important to emphasize from the Department of Justice perspective, the reason our mission is to make sure that we protect victims and make victims whole, regardless of what kind of criminal violation we're working. And so in the cyber context, we really hope that through strong private sector partnerships with victims feeling as though they can come forward and report early, we can make sure that we can do the best that we can to not only disrupt the malicious actors, but also to try to make victims whole through seizures, forfeitures, and to help with any threat problems. So I would say, you can go to the FBI, you can go to CISA if you have relationships with CISA as well. There are also other law enforcement agencies, including the US Secret Service with their Cyber Fraud Task Force. And so all of those entities, regardless of who they may be, feel comfortable having those relationships early on, maintaining them, because you want to have them in place. So that you can implement and know who to go to when there is an incident. Unfortunately, that happens. It's inevitable for almost all companies. And so you should have those relationships in place and feel comfortable going to them and knowing who to call when the worst case scenario hits.
This is a question we've been asking for more than 10 years now, so bear with me, but I'm asking it anyway today because companies are still asking. There is a significant concern about coming forward to the government and worrying about what does that information sharing lead to in terms of liabilities and concerns. And particularly, that question has become with increased relevancy in light of, for example, OFAC's guidance that paying ransom could be a violation. So what kind of protections are in place and what kind of privileges may exist for an entity that does come forward to the government, whether it's in a ransomware attack or otherwise?
So I think that's a good question. I think if I could take the OFAC guidance perspective first, I think we've been trying very hard across government when we're issuing guidance and policy directed at private sector to give them an understanding of how we're viewing these issues. OFAC has been revising its guidance to make clear that in circumstances in which victims come forward early and are transparent and cooperative with the government, it's definitely something that we will take under advisement, or OFAC will take under advisement in determining from their perspective whether or not there should be any enforcement action taken. Certainly, from the Department of Justice's perspective, we don't want to ever be in a situation where we are re-victimizing a victim. That's very important to us. And so you should not feel as though victims should not feel worried that by coming forward, somehow they're going to have a risk of some sort of collateral consequence. We wouldn't want, from a DOJ enforcement perspective, we wouldn't want that. I'll talk about the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative in a second, because I think sort of placing that in context is important here. But with regard to coming to law enforcement, obviously people are very worried. Victims are always very worried about their data and protecting their data, especially when they have been subject to such attacks. And law enforcement is unique in that we have authorities to protect victim data. First and foremost, most of that victim data can be covered under the grand jury secrecy rules, which are very strict in terms of what can be shared outside of a very limited group of people that are actually investigating a grand jury investigation. As a general rule, and this has been the case, there are ways in which we can make sure that we can work with victims in order for them to protect certain data from work product privilege or attorney-client privilege. Obviously, we're not really there to understand some of the internal thinking of the assessments that are happening that are sensitive to a company, either in preparation for a potential cyber incident or in the aftermath. We really just want the facts, because what we want to do is figure out what breadcrumbs of information, what intel leads we can follow in order to try to solve the case. And so I think in many instances, you'll be working with agents and prosecutors who understand the sensitivities of all these issues, and certainly can also enter into things like protective orders to make sure whatever data is collected from the victim is very well protected. So finally, I was talking shortly about the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative the department has recently announced. And so the idea behind that is that we're building on sort of our past enforcement experience in pursuing procurement and grant fraud. So this is really as it pertains to vendors who have relationships with the government and provide services in order to strengthen our supply chain. We understand that most businesses do their best when they contract the government to abide by contract terms and obligations, and that cyber intrusions can happen even when any contractor or business has robust monitoring, detection, and reporting. But sometimes there are instances in which a contractor may knowingly fail to implement or follow certain requirements or misrepresent their practices or capabilities to the government. We're really focused on making sure that we can enforce in a civil context the federal response to those instances where the federal government is essentially a victim of a failure of their third-party contractor to live up to the standards that they have contracted to do. So I think that's a very narrow set of circumstances. I know that there has been some view from the public that this will implicate or somehow harm the victim situation. And our view is that it is important to increase resiliency. It's another way that we're working to increase the resilience with all of the tools the department has. But certainly, all we're trying to do here is make sure that the federal government, as any other victim, ensuring that its contractual obligations and the obligations of vendors to make fair and transparent representations about their cybersecurity practices, that there is an enforcement mechanism to ensure that that happens.
And for the audience, just to mention, the fraud initiative has to do with the DOJ's recent announcement that you may impose False Claims Act liability on entities who make false statements or don't do what they said that they would do with regard to cybersecurity. And also
contract with us, yes.
Who contract with government, and who also, though, under the False Claims Act, that it could impose or could allow whistleblowers to come forward and bring qui tam actions, correct?
Right. And that it would have enhanced damages that are available under the FCA. But again, to emphasize this is no different than in any other contracting situation where there are vendors that provide services to the government. We just want to make sure that cybersecurity resilience is an area of focus for us. And it's consistent with sort of the spirit of recent executive orders that the president has put out with regard to making sure that that all federal agencies are strengthening their own resilience. It's just another tool that we have in our toolbox in order to ensure that that can happen.
With regard to the, and obviously for any of these points, we could spend a full long time. So but I'm going to move on just in the time we have. With regard to the descriptions that you gave earlier regarding the intelligence side and nation state attacks, how is the government thinking about where that line is in terms of a cyber crime or intelligence gathering or an act that would warrant a prosecution versus some other type of national security bucket type response?
Well, so I think it's important to see cyber, at least from the department's perspective, as a blended threat, and sort of the changing landscape is such that it's hard to sort of bucket actions into purely criminal or purely national security related. The reason for that is, I think ransomware is a prime example. It's something that obviously has been garnering a lot of attention from across government. And our view with regard to that is, look, oftentimes these are ransomware attacks are perpetrated by what we would call traditional criminal, transnational criminal organizations that are sort of loosely affiliated criminal actors that for which there is no express link to a nation state actor. Okay, they're doing it because they want to get rich. They're opportunistic and they want to try to make money. In those circumstances, they can still have a national security component because, as was sort of evident from Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods, and Kaseya, the impact of a ransomware attack can be upon a company that has a significant presence in a critical infrastructure sector. And in that aspect, you can see if a ransomware attack happens on our food supply, on the energy sector, on hospitals, that changes the sort of nature of the threat. So it's not just based on who the actors are, but also what the implications of that action is. And so, from a victim perspective or from the private sector perspective, I think that you should not be so concerned about what those distinctions are, because what we want to really do is, and why we encourage the private sector, strong relationships with the private sector and for victims to come forward, is it's very important for us to have a holistic, from a holistic vantage point, understand what the threat landscape truly looks like in order for us to both deal with those threats, understand how to best allocate resources and the like. When you're a victim and you have had an attack, you may not know ultimately who's responsible, and it still is very important to you. It doesn't really matter so much who is at the end of the keyboard, because you need to strengthen your own sort of response in the wake of such an attack. So you should come to us so that we can understand, what information, what sort of, what I would say, the means and methods of the attack, identifiers that might be helpful to try to understand what the infrastructure is that these attackers are using. And then we can see the broader landscape, ensure that information gets fed back through other victims. And we've been doing a lot of what I think is very important, using that type of information and doing proactive victim notification prior to the victims, oftentimes even knowing that they have that adversary in their system. And that only happens when we can have a lot of information from the private sector that we can build upon in our investigations. And so it really is a two-way street. And so it matters less who's at the end of the keyboard. It matters more that we can have that strong connectivity to ensure that we can have a real whole of society approach to these issues.
And one of the other recent DOJ initiatives has to do with a cryptocurrency task force. If you could just please describe what that is, but also how the government is thinking about the growth in fintech for legitimate reasons, as well as where we are seeing it in terms of ransomware demands and otherwise.
Right. So from our perspective, cryptocurrency is an incredibly interesting and emerging area. We've been working these types of cryptocurrency cases at least since the early 2012 on. But because of the use of cryptocurrency in a variety of cyber-related cases, including, for instance, the payment of ransoms and ransomware, but also just generally its use in fraud and other types of schemes to harm the American consumer. I think there is a view that cryptocurrency poses unique challenges to law enforcement. And so the creation of the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team is designed to centralize and build upon the department's existing expertise around cryptocurrency and its misuse. And to be clear, as you mentioned, cryptocurrency is and has legal uses. What we're really focused on is the illicit use of cryptocurrency in money laundering and tax evasion, sanctions evasion, and fraud schemes, and really in perpetrating the ecosystem that allows cybercrime to flourish through its pseudonymity. And so, we have made strides in combating cryptocurrency platforms that help cyber criminals launder and hide the proceeds of their crimes from law enforcement. And in establishing the NSET, we're trying to strengthen our capacity to dismantle the financial ecosystem that allows these bad actors to exploit cryptocurrency and profit from it. And so, we're trying to create the NSET. We also have a Cyber Fellows program that we've initiated this year in order to try to recruit the next generation of cyber prosecutors and people who are going to be working these issues for the next decade to come. And so, we're very excited about the NSET, and we hope that it's, the announcement is the beginning of many exciting other announcements in the future.
Eun-Young, thank you so much for making time for us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We're now going to shift gears to our panel, and then following our panel is Melissa Hathaway, who will provide some enlightenment on some of the issues as well that we are discussing. So we're really thrilled with, as I said earlier, just an all-star lineup for our program today. I also should take a moment to thank our sponsors, the William and Flora Hewitt Organization Foundation, and also Craig Newmark Philanthropies. So thank you. And thank you, dear audience, for joining us today. So if I can welcome our panel on screen, we have, again, awesome women all day, or at least for the 2 hours we are all together. I'm going to put on my glasses because I want to make sure that I get their bios right. And I'm not even going to give you all of their bios, but here's a quick summary for our rock stars here. We have Edna Conway, who's Vice President, Security and Risk Officer at Azure Hardware Systems and Infrastructure at Microsoft. She's a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Task Force on ICT Supply Chain Risk, various board positions, including most recently named to the board of ActiveCipher, and is on the board of Long Ridge Equity Partners, as well as other organizations, and an executive advisory board member of InfoSec Global. So welcome, Edna. We also are joined by Deneen DiFiore, a VP and Chief Information Security Officer of United Airlines. Such a cool background, Deneen. I'm not even going to ask if it's legit or not, but it just looks fabulous. I'm pretending to be on the subway today, but you get the win on that. So Deneen also is a board member for the Internet Security Alliance and also the Aviation Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So welcome, Deneen. We have Michaela McMurrow with us, who is a partner at the law firm Covington and Burling. She is a Madison Policy Forum Military Business Cybersecurity Fellow and a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who has been awarded the Bronze Star, which every time I read her bio again, I say, oh, so cool. So thank you and welcome, Michaela. And also with us is Boyden Rohner today, who is an Associate Director for Vulnerability Management for CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which you just heard our prior speaker talk about. Boyden also is the former Deputy Director for Operations of what's called the NCIC, the National Cyber and Communications Integration Center, which covers all the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And then also Boyden is a former US Navy Surface Warfare Officer. One day we're going to have coffee and I want to hear some of these stories. And welcome, so thrilled to have you join us, all you awesome women. So thank you. There's so much that I want to cover. We're going to have a quick moving conversation, and key topics that we want to hit on are supply chain risk, critical infrastructure risk, ransomware. I wasn't going to put that on the agenda, but it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and there's new stuff every time we turn around. So we have to talk about that today too. But Edna, let me start with you. We met about a decade ago on a panel about supply chain risk, and people are like, what even is that? Here we are today, the anniversary week of that thing called SolarWinds. What are the threats? What are we thinking about, or what should we be worrying about when it comes to supply chain risk?
Thanks. And it's certainly a privilege personally and for Microsoft to be part of this. Appreciate your including us. I think we live, as you know, in this hyper-connected world, and folks, amazingly enough, have come to the realization that we don't live there alone, right? That we all have this third-party ecosystem. What we've seen, whether it's with ransomware or other forms of attack, is that the attractiveness of an attack vector that allows the one-to-many analogy to come to fruition is picking up speed, right? So if I can go to a trusted third party and I can reach 25 targets that I might otherwise have had to attack 25 independent times in a customized way, that is seen as, quite frankly, efficiency from those who would seek to do harm. So what we're seeing is use of customized ransomware that is designed and targeted for specific events. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. We're also seeing the same things we've always seen, right? Identity and access management and credentials continue to be what people want. And we've seen some changes on the way in which we need to approach that, as some of the advanced persistent threat actors have become more sophisticated and deploy multiple attack vectors and can sit and wait, just like a nation state act, and have a lot of patience. So they can stay and lie in wait for upwards of 2 to 4 years as they continue to deploy and mine.
And Deneen, from your current role at United and previously at GE Aviation and your work on the ISAC, what are you thinking about for supply chain risk?
Yeah, so I think, especially any industry, but especially in the aviation industry, we operate as an ecosystem. You can't get a flight from point A to point B without thousands of different partner organizations working together to make that flight a success and safe. So we really have to lean in and collectively address supply chain risk as an industry. And I think that's probably the trend in a lot of places. You're actually better trying to fight the threat, right, and manage the risk collectively than each individual organization doing that. So we're working with organizations like the ISAC and Aviation ISAC and different other industry associations to really come up with standards and frameworks to help us kind of level set and say, what is the baseline? What is the standard of care for the aviation industry that we want to all kind of operate in? And then what are the mechanisms that we can collectively help each other? I don't know if it hit the news a couple weeks ago. There was a regional carrier that had an IT issue, and that cascaded and translated into thousands of canceled flights across the entire U.S. Right, so that disruption had a cascading impact, and we all have to kind of come together to say what can we do to help increase like resiliency, cyber resiliency, digital resiliency going forward. So I think one of the things, the last thing I'll say on this is, the one thing that we've historically done around third-party risk is really focused on, I'll say, data access and types of data and data protection, which is absolutely, we need to do that. And we need to stay prudent around that. But we also have to look at operational resiliency. How do these partners in your ecosystem and suppliers, how do they impact your operation? If they're not able to recover from any type of cyber security breach or incident, what does that impact you? How does that impact your operations? And then how do you work collectively to help them get back, if you can, back on track? So it's really that, data access piece, a historic focus there, and then really kind of pivoting and talking about operational resiliency as well.
Thank you. Thank you both. So Michaela, as our lawyer on the panel, when we talk about supply chain, all sorts of questions come to mind. I'm going to throw you a compound question. What does it mean as to do with disclosures and liability and transferability of liability and insurance on supply chain? Have at it, please.
Sure. Well, thank you. And, just to pick up on the thread that Edna and Deneen have been talking about, I think it's really a story of interconnectedness, right? Supply chain risk is a flavor of vendor risk, third-party risk. And what we realize is that as a business or as a company, as you contract with different organizations. You're contracting them for their services, but to a certain extent, you're also buying their risk. And so what does that mean, right? We're interconnected, you have to manage it. And I think, one of the things about managing this risk is that it doesn't happen at a single moment in time. You really have to manage this risk through time. You have to do some diligence up front about the folks that you're working with. You want to get those contractual provisions in there in terms of your contracts to protect yourself, to have some measure of recourse if things go wrong, but also more importantly, perhaps to incentivize risk management in the course of performing the services. And then finally, you have to manage the contract, right? So even if you've done your diligence and even if you've got those great contractual provisions in there, this is not really a set it and forget it environment. You have to sort of keep up with the vendors. What's happening with them? Are they having incidents? What are they seeing? So there's a management aspect to it. So even if you decide to outsource certain functions, it's not at no cost or risk to the organization. You have to continue to kind of monitor that relationship. And what does that mean from a liability perspective? Well, Deneen already touched on it, and I think cybersecurity more broadly, it's a trend we've seen before. Reasonableness is really the touchstone, and it's often reasonableness in the law. In commercial contracts, which is probably the kind of thing we're talking about here, you can have service standards that talk about delivering services in a way that's commercially reasonable. Sometimes you can get industry standard, industry best, but you really want to pay attention to that language. And when there's a contract on point, the contract usually controls, right? So when you're talking about vendor risk, it's often a business to business relationship, and the contract is usually what's going to dictate sort of how the liabilities shake out. The last thing I would say is, when it comes to these contracts and what the law says about how they are to be interpreted, there is some emerging case law in this area, but in the B2B context, many times you'll see an arbitration provision. And so many of these disputes are being resolved in arbitration. And what that means is that it's not that they're not happening, it's that the facts going into those decisions and the awards on the other side may not always be available in the same way as if these were public disputes. So lots of interesting issues from the legal risk perspective.
Great, thanks. So I have follow-up questions for you all, but I want to hear from you, Boyden, CISA to the rescue. What are you all doing at CISA to help us and entities navigate these tricky issues on supply chain risk?
Awesome. Thank you, Judith. Well, if the audience is not totally familiar with us, we are the newest agency in the federal government, newest agency at the Department of Homeland Security. We just had our third birthday in October. So I think that's there's got to be a great analogy there. In dog years, we're still have a lot of experience in our short time, but have a lot of maturing to go relative to all of our other federal counterparts. But we were stood up to lead the nation's effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to critical infrastructure, both on the cybersecurity side and the physical side. Just want to make sure folks are aware of that. I of course, work in the cybersecurity division. And, we are positioned to take advantage of our unique vantage point at the intersection of the intelligence community, the federal civilian executive branch, and industry to convene those communities to solve these enormous problems that we're already starting to discuss. And we do this through a number of different ways. We offer many services that are free of charge to all all types of resource organizations that underpin national critical infrastructure. And we use the information that we glean through those services and the relationships we've built to promulgate, best practices and guidance and set standards where we can, mostly for the federal civilian executive branch. And then it's our hope that those standards will, in many cases, inspire other critical infrastructure sectors or national critical function owner and operators to adopt those same standards. Earlier this year, for example, we put out CISA's three bad practices that were meant to, sort of establish that standard of care, if I can borrow that term from Deneen, hoping that would really inspire, maybe insurance companies or legal frameworks to kind of recognize that if you're not doing those things, you're really not carrying your weight as a member of the entire cybersecurity ecosystem. As Edna mentioned, we're all in this together. Everybody's interdependent. So that's really a big thing for us. And also, we were instrumental in contributing to the president's executive order on raising the standards for cybersecurity to the federal civilian executive branch and national critical infrastructure. And, to Michaela's point, including stronger language to manage contracts, because, since so much risk is transferred to the third parties, to the vendors, we really our big way of accountability and setting the expectations is through that contract language. So those are the ways we're taking the ideas that we have, or listening to the different stakeholders and communities that we're working with, and trying to make those ideas universal to help secure the American people through critical infrastructure.
And to the point of, and this I'm throwing out to the panel here, but to the point of having practices, best practices, and the flip side, as Boyden mentioned, bad practices, as well as a presidential executive order, do we need more specified in laws, or are standards and guidance enough?
So let me jump in, if I may, on that one. I probably have a contrarian view, but I think the beauty of what CISA has done is, as Boyden articulated beautifully, what we can do is pull the private sector in to give guidance to regulators or legislators, whether on the civilian or the defense side, around what can be done practically and what is feasibly impractical. I mean, at some point you can do almost anything with the right amount of time, energy, money, and people, but we need to be mindful of that. And so I have a very strong view that light touches in contracts are absolutely the way to go, because, I mean, just look at, for example, my security and resiliency architecture. There's over 300 controls. It references other international standards. You would take, 7 years to negotiate the contract. If you added on I think there's a stack of policies about several inches thick that we ask our suppliers to adhere to, right, when engaging in business with us. And I'm sure Deneen has a whole another set that address many of the same issues. And that includes physical security, as Boyden mentioned, logical operational security, behavioral security, information security, intellectual property protection, privacy. It's a comprehensive view. So light touching contracts, one, because contracts shift risk, they don't drive operational resilience. Controls drive operational resilience and relationships. And then last but not least, probably not a heavy set of laws, but as one of the outcomes that came out of the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is continuing and was started right around when CISA was born, so to speak, because we've been at it for 2.5 years, was what we really need when we think about supply chain risk and in specificity around cyber is the sharing of critical information around the naming of names when we see something, and how do we do that in democracy? There's an area where law can help. We're actually looking for industry to come together to make a request for a safe harbor law, so that we can start to share information that we have, and because we have the privilege of living in a democracy, be free from some of the claims that could be made, such as intentional interference with business advantage, breach of contract, breach of confidentiality, defamation, and the like, and allow us to get to some degree of rigor where we can say, look, this is happening, and it's going to be shared in a way that's rigorous and diligent, but it's going to help all of us in that interconnected ecosystem.
Taking one of the audience questions on the third-party risk management issue, though, is there a concern if we don't have an arching or overarching federal law that there would be different state standards and perhaps even industry-driven standards that could become more burdensome than a uniform way? Or is this like what we've seen in the data privacy context, where efforts to have one standard with all the different add-ons, it just keeps failing for that reason? Thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts on that. I mean, I'm kind of pretty heavily advocating for that, I'll say unified kind of baseline or standard of care. Because, you know, when you talk about what's prudent to do and how to protect your operation or your data or your customers and consumers' data, you know, there's a lot of time and effort that's spent on compliance activities. Like, did you do this? Yes or no? And there are 50,000 frameworks that, you know, as an international global business, we have to harmonize and make sure we're doing X, Y, Z here, and those controls map into there. So there's a lot of time and energy that's spent on that. And what we really need to get to is, okay, yes, this is the standard of care that we all should be doing as a baseline, but what outcomes are we really trying to drive? And then demonstrating those outcomes. So for instance, if we're saying, okay, this is ransomware is a big risk and these 5 things that you need to do. Okay, yes, you did those 5 things, but are they practically working in your environment? Have you tested your immutable backups, and have you recovered 5 times during the year? So if something happens, you're prepared and you have at least the confidence in, you know, of what we know to be the standard, the best practice, and how to operationally translate in an environment. So, you know, we recently become regulated by the TSA in our world, right, by CISA, which is, I don't think it's a bad thing, but we need to work together to generate the outcomes versus, okay, did you do these things versus are you able to recover or be resilient or prevent? So that's kind of my view of how we need to kind of shift thinking.
We may come back to supply chain because I do have more questions, but I want to make sure we cover all of our topics, which includes now critical infrastructure risk, and then we're going to get into and dig in a little more on that ransomware questions. With regard to critical infrastructure, you know, we are seeing significant, I think, but I'm curious what y'all think, what seems to be a significant increase in attacks and a disturbing lack of norms. You know, we're seeing hospitals hit and pipelines hit and the water sector hit. And where are we going with this? What is going to be done with that? And let me start with you, Edna, in terms of from the industry's perspective. And from your perspective on your boards as well, dealing with these issues, I should add.
I think what you're seeing is, so it's almost the opposite of what we've done in industry, where we've been experts on attack vectors and looking at what's coming at us. And we continue to strive to increase the robustness of our technological prowess. What we're seeing on the ransomware side is their technical prowess is growing, but they've also gotten smarter. So the reason why you see what looks like scattershot is actually because they're smartly targeting where and when they can hurt you the most. Because when ransomware, as opposed to spyware, which can sit and wait and lay for years to gather information, they want to make sure that they're hitting you at your worst spot. So we're seeing targeted mergers and acquisitions. We're seeing targeted layouts, and I bet Boyden can elaborate on this. When there's an expansion of critical infrastructure physically, where it's going to stop you the most. We're also seeing it happen when you have a new opportunity because there's a new business that is coming out. So they're getting smarter to say, well, I just don't want to go to this bank. I want to go to that bank at this time because this is what they're doing. And if you think about the old bank robber days, Judith, right? I knew when the delivery was coming. I knew when the train was coming in. I knew where the bags of money were going to be. They're now applying effectively social engineering capabilities, which is marvelous for them, harder for us. And that's exactly what you're seeing with the scattershot. So it goes back to what Deneen said, which is if you don't have a foundational architectural framework on these are the things we have to do, this is how we're testing them across our ecosystem so that we can be prepared to recover and regain operational resilience, because operational resilience being regained swiftly thwarts the goal of those who would seek to stop our efficient recovery.
With regard to critical infrastructure, Boyden, CISA has some focus in that area, and what are the resources available for those agencies?
Yeah, thank you, Judith. Yeah, I would say it's, exclusively our focus in terms of, there is, every single facet of American society relies on internet connected devices and things like that. But, we can only invest our energy in what is going to help the American people live their lives, and that is critical infrastructure. So that's exclusively our focus. But even the entirety of critical infrastructure is an enormous undertaking to try to secure and make resilient. So within that, we have been trying to decompose it into national critical functions, which transcend each of the 16 critical infrastructures. So we have been focused on working with the private sector, which is, by last count, sort of the owners and operators of 80% of US critical infrastructure, to figure out, what are those nodes, what are those systems that are so that so much is riding on, that if taken down, are going to have a far-reaching consequence. And we are really working hard via our National Risk Management Center, which is bringing together diverse stakeholders, both from the intelligence community, from the federal government, and then from all of the different sectors, to try to understand what those elements are so that we can invest more resources to secure them or bring more information to help those critical infrastructure owners and operators secure themselves. Because it is really worth pointing out, for those who aren't aware, we as CISA have authorities to help secure the federal civilian executive branch, but we have limited authority in securing US critical infrastructure. We have the authority to come and help. We have authority to bring information, but we don't have the authorities to offer, as many services as we think would be warranted. And so, we have to really, coach and enable and, uplift all of those partners who are working on towards the same mission.
And Michaela, I know that so much of your legal advisory work involves really crossing the divide, advising major US private sector entities, as well as critical infrastructure, as well as dealing with some national security issues. So from a legal perspective, what do you see in terms of these attacks on critical infrastructure and ways that we should be considering the legal implications of that?
Yeah, thank you. And, from my perspective, where I said I get to see some, portion of that 80% of the private sector that Boyden was talking about in terms of, where, those companies are and those critical infrastructure entities sit. And, what I can say is that in this past year, the real hallmark of the critical infrastructure space in terms of legal advice has been the flurry of federal activity, right? And I think, Boyden can speak to that. I think Deneen can speak to that as well, but also just more activity than we've seen in a while on critical infrastructure. And so, what does that mean? Well, thinking more about the infrastructure, thinking more about industrial controls, thinking about the role of agencies that haven't traditionally been featured in cyber, like TSA, thinking about critical infrastructure in terms of pipelines and airlines. And I'd love Deneen's thoughts on this, and rail, right? We have rail getting on board too. So we've got a lot of interesting issues. I think the questions that we see are questions about what does this mean for the private sector companies, right? What does this mean? And I don't think that's totally clear yet. I think there's a flurry of activity. I think there are amendments that have been proposed, for example, to the National Defense Authorization Act that relate to reporting requirements and reporting on issues like ransomware. That hasn't totally shaken out yet. So we're still tracking that and waiting to see what that looks like. But from my perspective, I think there are questions about what does this mean for us? And it's a little bit of a race in terms of keeping up with the developments which are coming out in a way that's really fast and furious these days. So lots of motion, lots of interest, lots of activity from the federal government. That's what we see from our perspective on critical infrastructure.
Thank you. And Deneen, how is the industry responding, or how would you recommend business leaders thinking about all that motion that Michaela was just talking about?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand, to be actually in the rulemaking process. If you have an industry association, like a lobbying association, like we have Airlines for America, to get in there as these changes are being proposed within the critical infrastructure sectors, so you can work through and make sure that what the proposals are you can practically implement, and then also that we're achieving the same outcomes. There's a lot of activity no matter where it is. Michaela mentioned a bunch of different legislation. I think last I counted it was like 27, 41. I don't know. The number keeps changing, right? Around cybersecurity reporting and disclosures and new things that you have to do. So it's a lot. I would say definitely align to your industry and understand what that means. Have a voice in shaping the rules. Submit your comments, and then really understand from a practicality, a gap analysis around what it takes for you to be able to kind of meet the objectives and those outcomes. If it's reporting within 24 hours, right? That's a lot for a private company to ask them to do, because you're right at 24 hours, you're just trying to figure out what the heck is going on and what is the impact to your business, and how best you're going to go forward. It's unclear what the reciprocating government entity is going to do at that time. So we need to start to work through that. So there's a lot of, what is a reportable incident, right? The way some of the language and definitions are defined, it's kind of like if you find malware on an endpoint, you're supposed to report it. Well, I'll use Jen Easterly's words. That's noise. That's not a signal, right? We got to get down to what we're trying. What are we really trying to achieve? We're trying to protect, critical infrastructure and national security and all the companies and agencies that make that up. So there's, it's early stages. I think it's the right thing to do, but there's a lot of kind of definition and refining to get to a place where I think we're all going to be like, yeah, that makes sense, and that's really going to improve our posture collectively as a critical infrastructure operators and as a nation.
And now when we talk about critical infrastructure cybersecurity, is it really getting worse, or are we just getting more aware?
I think there are advanced persistent threat actors who are getting more sophisticated. We recently talked about how we've leveraged a partnership with the federal government to actually gain approval to go seek legal authority to shut down some of what we see in telemetry coming in, right? So if you look at the recent, I think came out this week, our efforts around a Chinese hacking group that we call Nickel, but you could also, go back to Nobelium, which was the Russian, identified by the US as a Russian state-sponsored hacking group that, worked with SolarWinds as their methodology, not that SolarWinds was in partnership with them. Let me clarify that. I think what we can do together, there's an example of public-private partnership where we can use the courts to go and shut some things down. Is that comprehensive? No. To Deneen's point, you have to look at it from an overall operational resiliency. But I think to date, just between those two, we've taken down about 10,000 malicious websites and shut down the ability to go raise up another 600,000 sites that are using the same telemetry trajectory and techniques. And to me, that's a glaring activity where we can come together looking at our threat intelligence capabilities, the governmental threat intelligence capabilities, and draw conclusions. So people are getting more sophisticated in how they attack us. And yes, we are all paying attention. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I'll liken it to, are more people smoking cigarettes? Probably not. But when government and public came together to say there are threats to human health around cigarette smoke, you saw a change. And that's the direction that I think all of us are trying to get to, working together.
To Edna's point earlier about the importance of identity and access management, and a point that Michaela had made about not just having these contractual provisions, but actually following up to see if they're being followed and managing third-party risk. How much of this is are the solutions technological focused versus governance focused? I'd say you need both, but what do you all think on that?
So I'm happy to jump in. I think I agree with you. I think you need both. And to pick up on a point that I think Deneen made really well, both on the third party risk and also on critical infrastructure, there's a question about practicality here, which is there can be a regulation or a law that requires the gold standard contractual terms. But if the reality is that in any individual contract negotiation, one party has a lot of leverage and the other one doesn't, the ability of the party with the lesser amount of leverage to get those terms in is going to be limited. And so I think that when you think about the terms and when you think about sort of the legal structure that you're going to put around it, it's important to put some guidelines around it and some framework, but there has to be flexibility. It can't be too prescriptive such that you end up with companies who are not able to comply just as soon as the law is passed. So for that reason, and also I'm sure there are others on the call better qualified to talk about these things, but just the pace of technical change in this area, I think that it's important to have flexibility built into any of these frameworks. And I also think that while you want the contracts to lay out expectations and also lay out potential recourse if expectations are not met, I think the important thing is putting the incentives in place so that you put the right risk management processes in place, and hopefully you don't ever have to get to that point where you're looking at recourse and remedies and termination and all of those other things, right? If this is done in a way that's really optimizing, many variables, then hopefully all of the parties involved would have the right incentives to kind of put the controls in place on their side as they're able to and as makes sense given the sort of commercial realities. But I don't want to forget the important point that Deneen made about the practical implications of trying to actually make these frameworks, operate in the way they're intended, kind of when the rubber meets the road.
I'd love to jump in and help and answer this question too. Great answers, Deneen and Michaela. First of all, through all of the services that CISA offers, I'd like to adapt that Stephen Covey phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast to technology is eaten by culture when it comes to implementing things. So I really, we're seeing time after time when we go and do proactive security assessments on, very mature and involved organizations that are also complex because they're big bureaucracies, that they are struggling with securing their identity access management because they don't have the right governance structures in place. And so you have to get that right. You have to have a CEO or CEO equivalent who can lead change and bring an entire leadership team together to focus on business risk and make the decisions that the organization needs for themselves. So I really want to emphasize that point. And then, I also just want to circle back to a really great topic that you brought earlier about just the practicality of implementing the different regulations and laws and things like that. Deneen and Michaela, you brought up great points. Being on the other side of the table here as somebody who contributes to those kinds of, documents and standards. CISA is not CISA in the cybersecurity side. We're not regulators. Our chemical brethren, are on the physical side, but not so much on from cybersecurity division. But I can tell you that having been a customer of CISA before I joined, being a SOC manager who was responsible for trying to figure out what kinds of things to report to CISA and going through all the different memos and trying to, make a decision tree. The one thing that I often would forget was that the spirit is about information sharing. The spirit is about coming forward early and often with information, even when you're still in that fog of war, because then you gain a partner trying to connect those dots before a problem gets out of control. And I think, there has been an enormous emphasis by our director, Jen Easterly, by standing up the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is, our newest arm to try to develop operational relationships between so many industry and government partners so that we can share information even in those fog of war moments. Having lived through it a number of times this year on some of the biggest incident responses, we were able to respond much more quickly and break the case sort of open by having great industry partners come forward with information when they only had part of the story. But by taking those two parts of the story together, we were able to make sense much more quickly of incidences that were affecting lots of federal agencies, lots of critical infrastructure owners and operators. And if it wasn't for that trust that came, that brought those people to the table to talk with us, we would still be, probably responding and having our lunch eaten by the adversaries and not remediating as quickly.
And I can say, Boyd, and having sat in on some of CISA's briefings, you do a phenomenal job. And this is the worst, biggest thing ever, until a couple of weeks later when we got, this is the worst, biggest thing ever. So we really appreciate the work that you are doing. Edna, you've been at the forefront of public-private collaboration for many, many years. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The fact that we're still talking about information sharing, how do we improve it, might make us think it's not working as well as it is or could be. But what are your thoughts on that?
So look, I think life is an evolution, right? And so, for any of you who've ever either raised a child or been around someone raising a child, it never ends, right? And even for we ourselves, we're constantly learning. So I would never really say information sharing is broken. I would say we continue to evolve and get better in terms of how do we get more finite? How do we get more discrete? Because if we're not sharing the right kind of information, people can't weave together the whole picture. So it's a puzzle and somebody's got to put the pieces together. I do think, though, that, given how much is out there, you still need to step back and say, I have an architecture that is a base foundation. And that, Deneen and I have talked about this for years, where these are my primary things that I do no matter what. And you can always build on that, on top of that, when something changes. But the information sharing in the public-private way that goes beyond, let's say, an ISAC or an ISAO or a sector coordinating council into a coordinated approach that might include, let's use the US, ODNI, CISA, and NSA together. So I'm getting SIGINT and OSINT and operational and IT, because at the end of the day, critical infrastructure in today's day and age, it operates in a digital environment. The old days are gone. OT is not, completely air gapped any longer. Never will be ever again. So if we don't recognize that and we don't bring that three-legged stool together, I think we're going to have a problem. So don't take it as negative. Just say we constantly strive to make it better, but we're not there yet. We're still not there yet. And we have a law. We have the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, and we still don't have, we have all of these things happening, and it still happens. Judith, you know it, and I know it the same way we all do. I pick up the phone and I say, Deneen, what are you seeing and what are you doing? And Deneen calls someone else that they trust, and we talk to some of our government colleagues. We need to do better at that. And that's why I'm so hard pressed on that. Can we relieve ourselves of the burden that comes with the privilege of a democracy, to get some safe harbors, to say, yeah, if we're sharing it in good faith, we can move faster together.
Thank you. So ransomware, Michaela, the threat has been evolving. What are we seeing right now?
Yeah, great question. I feel like ransomware was the hot topic a couple of years ago, and now we're back, right? It's here we are again. I've heard last summer referred to as, summer of 2021 referred to as the summer of ransomware. So we'll see, but it's certainly kept us busy. In terms of what we see, folks on this call might know, but the sort of old style of ransomware was just kind of a straight encryption approach, right? Where a threat actor would get on your systems and encrypt your files and demand the payment in order to decrypt them so that you could have access again. And in that model, companies that had backups and recent backups and were able to restore quickly might ignore the threat and clean up and restore from backups and move on. We saw an evolution in the last year or so, and what that model now, it's called double extortion. And what happens now is that a threat actor will get on your system and they will take a copy of the data before they encrypt it. And so what this does is it introduces some complications into, into the ransomware threat model. First they can demand a ransom for decryption as they did before. So if you don't have those backups, you don't have the ability to restore, you might feel some pressure there. But then they also have a copy, and that means that they have other things they can do. They can threaten to post the copy, they can threaten to disclose the copy, and they can demand a ransom to not post or to have that copy destroyed. But the interesting thing from a legal perspective is that what this shift introduced is exposure to many of the data breach laws, right? The data breach laws are triggered by access and exfiltration. And so under the old model, if data was encrypted without being accessed and without being exfiltrated, it meant that you might be able to restore without having those laws implicated. But now, with the exfiltration aspect, especially, there's a potential here that you're looking at obligations under data breach laws when you experience one of these incidents. And so that, of course, brings in the whole host of consequences in terms of notifications to regulators and others related to and based on the kind of information that's impacted, or to other businesses if you have obligations, under your contracts to notify on these kinds of incidents. So the legal risk related to ransomware has changed in light of this new model, and that has created leverage for threat actors that have sorted this out, and it's created sort of interesting and complicated questions for folks trying to figure out what to do. And we get a lot of questions about, okay, what's my answer? What is my answer going to be when my company experiences this? And I think what we typically say is that has to be considered on a case-by-case basis, right? What kind of information was impacted? Is it the company's information, or is it somebody else's information? What do you know about the threat actor, right? What do you know about what's happening in the background? And there, close partnerships with law enforcement and others that can possibly give you insight into what's happening and what they know about this threat actor become really important. So lots of interesting things happening, and certainly very, very busy in that respect.
Thank you. Because the problem wasn't hard enough yet. Deneen, one of the audience questions is, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but what are the considerations for an organization to decide whether to pay or not pay?
Yeah, so I think, I would love to say don't pay, right? Like, because, these are criminal organizations, we pay and we perpetuate we perpetuate it when we pay, when companies pay. But the bottom line is it's a business decision, right? A lot of companies have to weigh, their capabilities of recovering and getting back to stable operations. And if the decryptor key is going to help be a tool in their toolkit to help them, what should they consider? They might consider it, right? So I think it's really important as you think about these things, it's to bring in not just the cybersecurity team and the legal teams, but the business leaders, the operations teams, treasury, the finance teams, to really understand what the cost of an event is to your business, and then how you would make those decisions, what the criteria is. It's got a lot to do with your capability and your confidence in recovery. But one of the things I would caution as well too, even if you make that ransomware payment and you get a decryptor key, that decryptor key is just like, well, first of all, it's developed by a criminal organization. So, how do you think they have a robust quality assurance organization that's testing that out? Probably not. But the other thing too is that decryptor key has to be work in your environment. And like any piece of software, how long and hard that takes to push that through. So it's not a golden ticket to get out of a crisis. And that's a lot of the education that I've done with my executive leaders and boards, to say, payment is not the answer. It's really our ability to recover. If we pay, we might get a decryptor key. It might give us some insights into who and how and what the approach would be, but it's not going to be our ticket out of the crisis.
And Boyden, what's CISA's role in terms of helping organizations address ransomware threats?
Yeah, well, we've got a number of different roles, but the federal government is always there to help critical infrastructure owners and operators recover. And so we work in close partnership with the FBI. A call to one of us in the federal government is a call to any of us to come. And in CISA's regard, we are there for asset response. So we are there to help get owners and operators back up and running. Again, of course, FBI is there to help make a case and do threat response, but we're there to help get owners and operators up and running again. But also, and probably more importantly, to underscore a term that Edna's been using today, which is operational resilience. That's going to be the key, because every one of us now should just expect that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so therefore you want to be you want your organization to be best positioned to be able to respond. And this is where CISA has just invested a lot of our energy and efforts, is by making available things like incident response playbooks, tabletop exercises that you can download from our website and run for your own organization, our variety of proactive cybersecurity services that either you can do by yourself, like our CSET tool, which you can download and ask yourself these questions at your own self-paced way to try to get a better sense of your own security posture, or you can sign up at the CISA website for our, first of all, if you're not signed up for our alerts, I highly recommend that the audience kind of multitask and do that right now, because they will change your life, because we bring everything together into one place to make it easy for you to know, what's being targeted by adversaries, what are the most recently exploited new vulnerabilities, what are the biggest attacks that are going on. I mean, I subscribe to them as an individual and they make my life much easier. But in addition to getting signed up for the latest information so that you can use it for your own organization, go ahead and sign up for our services, which are highly scalable, like our network vulnerability scanning service. We call that cyber hygiene. We have tons of data that shows that organizations that sign up for our service reduce their days to patch known exploited vulnerabilities, which are the most worrisome, and also critical and high vulnerabilities. And we're always offering and layering in new services within there. Even if you pay for a similar service in the private sector, that's great. Use ours as a check and balance to a service you're getting right now. And also you're doing your civic duty by helping us, get a temperature taken of the sector or critical infrastructure you're supporting. That data is all only shared within CISA. We don't make use of it except for just understanding greater risk. So, sign up for our alerts, sign up for our services, check out our website and look for other tools like our tabletop exercises and things like that. And this is your taxpayer dollars at work trying to make your lives easier. And we have a lot to offer there.
Edna, there's an audience question as to whether moving into the cloud can help reduce ransomware risk for organizations. Would you address that, please?
Yeah, so look, I don't think any of those of us who are cloud service providers are going to look at you and say, we're going to give you a completely clean and pristine, environment at all times. What we are going to do is say, we understand that you've woven us into the very fabric of your business. And so availability is absolutely essential to your continuation and operational resilience. And we built that in, whether it's through containerization, segmentation, and load shifting, to ensure that we have the capability if something happens to move swiftly. I also think there's a realization as a cloud provider that our customers bring their enemies with them into the environment. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that we're only as good as all of us are. And so, trying to get ahead of that and seeing what we can see while honoring privacy laws and confidentiality, and looking at encrypted telemetry so you can't actually see the content, but you can see trends and say, we have a problem here, is something that we take pretty seriously, and is what allows us, in all honesty, to start to see some of these what I'll call pivotal factors that allow us to target an advanced persistent threat actor to make us better. So it's a biased answer. I know what we're doing. So I feel comfortable that I'm better in the cloud than if I were operating in this wonderful environment that you're looking at here, which is the Conway household, right? So I like to have that power with me, but I think we would be naive if we didn't recognize that the third parties who come to us as our suppliers and the customers who come to us also have their own trajectory of risk, and we need to embrace that and prepare for it. And I'll put another plug in for, if you look at some of the supply chain risk management task force output that came out of CISA, we have done some remarkable work that is not just from the wonderful resources in the government agencies, but has private sector input as well on threat lists and contract language and ways to evaluate. So there are tools for those who are not large multinationals and are small and medium businesses to leverage.
That also helps to address an audience question regarding the two-way information sharing, not just CISA conveying information on threats, but getting it back as well from the private sector so they can better do their job and work on helping us. And Deneen, if you could just speak a little bit of to that point, given your role as a board member with the Internet Security Alliance and also on the Aviation ISAC.
Yeah, so I think, the information sharing, like Edna made a great point, is continuing to evolve. I think it's really important that information is shared in a timely, and the timely manner is also actionable, right? As we look at utilizing organizations like an ISAC, I kind of think of it as right now, it's the kind of norm or standard way organizations in a particular sector or industry can share threat information, and in a trusted and confidential way, right? So they're assured that that information is applicable and it's vetted, and they can start to take the proactive actions. So, I encourage my organization, when I was at GE and now that at United, really is to make sure that we are sharing as much as we think is valuable. Again, we want to create those signals, right? Things that are actionable, really focus on if you have not just IOCs, but TTPs or intersections and nexuses that you think that might be valuable to that community, because when you start to have that collective intelligence, then you're starting to get output and people start to collaborate and kind of give back as well too. So you'll see products that generate from that initial information sharing. And I think that's really the end goal is, okay, somebody shares a piece of information, the community, whether it's, expands to public organizations as well, or private public partnerships, then there's a product that really people are able to take action on. And we say, yes, we integrated this intelligence into our framework or our environment, and we were able to mitigate or prevent things from happening because of that. So definitely a way where we want to be.
And Michaela, we've seen that there are legally input incentives for companies that cooperate in terms of how they may be viewed by regulators. But on the other hand, sharing information suggests that if I'm disclosing it, perhaps then that's a bigger disclosure issue, whether to the SEC or otherwise. And so that can sometimes get tricky for organizations. What's some thoughts that they should consider in that legal risk perspective?
Sure, that's a great point, Judith, and it's one of the questions we commonly face. Well, on the one hand, where you really would like to share information and see an opportunity to do so in a way that makes sense from a threat information sharing perspective, but on the other, you have other responsibilities, you have other stakeholders, you have other parts of your business, and you may be concerned about action or reaction from other parts of the government, whether in the moment or down the road. And so, I think there you really have to think about the specific kinds of information, the nature of the information sharing, the timing of the information sharing, the reasons driving the information sharing in the moment, and the broader narrative that you have about whatever has happened. But certainly that's something I think that's front of mind with companies when they're faced with these questions, right? Is, if I share something now, what are the follow-on impacts for me down the road. To flag one of the areas in terms of case law that we've seen develop, we talked before about forensic reports related to forensic investigations of cybersecurity incidents. They were protected, pretty clearly under the case law for a while. We had a series of cases that showed that, these could be protected as privileged information if they were done by counsel, under direction and supervision of counsel for purposes of legal risk and legal advice. And just recently, over the last year, we've had a few cases that have gone in the other direction that has made that a more complicated analysis. And so that's just a very practical example of, a case where there's information that might be helpful, useful, that you might want to share for some reasons, but that has other, implications if you do. And so you kind of got to assess it in the moment, figure out the specific facts and circumstances surrounding the sharing and get to your comfort level. So it's one of those things like ransomware, I think, where it doesn't lend itself nicely to a clean answer, going in. I think you really have to look at the facts and the context and assess at that moment, given the different stakeholders. And I think Deneen highlighted that nicely as well, that, you have to then take your perspective and your lens and bring that back to other parts of the business for input as well.
There's also an audience question about the critical need for a more collaborative approach to safeguarding critical infrastructure. We've been talking about CISA and as a federal agency working with the private sector, but we also see, particularly with regard to critical infrastructure, a number of different state and municipal governments involved, and with oversight. Sometimes there's a problem of getting that coordination on the local level, never mind national. Is there more that can be done to help overall at those different levels of government? Boyden, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. State and local governments, have risks that they need to manage too, and so it makes sense that they want to convene the stakeholders in that are relevant and instrumental in provisioning the services that those state and local governments do. And so we've seen that particularly around elections, I think of, and then some of these, like the municipalities that have suffered from attacks on the water and wastewater sector this year, and lots of ransomware attacks. So it's important to have a strong relationship with your state and local government who is responsible for providing services. But I, again, would like to just refresh people's memory that, cyber is not necessarily a regional endeavor, and, vulnerabilities that affect one area likely exist all the way across the board. They transcend sectors, they transcend national critical functions. And so if you are really authentic and trying to get ahead of the problem, that advocating for, broader information sharing and, incident reporting, early is going to be the way to keep, all Americans secure, as opposed to taking a more limited view. Really what drives our efforts to increase operational resilience across the board is applying lessons learned from one place to a greater construct. And so so that's just really the point that I would like to make is, yes, regional work is important. It's where relationships really begin when they're in close proximity. That high trust can really begin at that regional, or when you're in physical proximity. But the goal should be to turn those into systemic relationships that can benefit a wider group.
Thanks. So, as you all have made clear in our time together, these are really difficult issues. They continue to be serious challenges, and a lot is at stake in not getting it right. It takes an interdisciplinary approach of technologists, governance experts, lawyers, business and policy people. Where do we find them? How do we recruit them? And how do we mentor them to raise up the ranks and become like the fabulous women that you four are here? Who wants to start on that one? Edna?
I'll start on it. Look, it's not easy. And I think we have to open our minds to to looking for the right talent for the right role, and be aware that, you know, in the old days you had apprenticeships, and there are so many wonderful educational institutions now that are doing work in cybersecurity. I mean, if you want somebody to do pen testing, they have to know how to do a pen test, right? But we sometimes pivoted on certain educational backgrounds, certain degree areas, some certain courses of study, and dare I say it, certain certifications. I would say the way we best do this in today's environment is look for people who have the skill sets and the innate curiosity and capability to learn, and bring them into the fold and see what naturally is their proclivity. Because you're going to find amazing things if you get somebody. I have a former military person who's a Six Sigma black belt who worked on the tool that is a GRC tool that actually embodies all of my controls. So we deploy it through a GRC tool, but it's not being used for GRC. And it also contains the repository of all evidence. That would never have come to fruition if I looked for somebody who was in this box. Right. And then the last thing I'll leave us with is we had better get really serious about changing the curriculum in the elementary and the high school levels, because we are not teaching digital natives how to actually thrive in a digital environment. And we're woefully behind on that.
Deneen, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what Edna said. It's really around hiring on, potential in a lot of cases. There's a ton of transferable skills that a lot of different people from different backgrounds, different experiences can bring to the table and be great cybersecurity and digital risk professionals. So I think definitely we want to lean into that. I'll just kind of give a plug for, we have a saying at United, especially in our digital technology group, that inclusion propels, inclusion propels innovation, right? And that's what happens when you get people that think, have different experiences, different thought processes, different backgrounds to come together to solve the such difficult, complex problems that cybersecurity and digital transformation risk is bringing to us. I mean, that's when you're going to get the best results. So I think we just have to open our lens and the aperture a little bit wider and look for talent in different places.
And Michaela, from the attorney's view, how do we identify both the opportunities for careers as well as attorneys in this important space?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to report it's sort of 8-lane highway right now in terms of lawyers and cybersecurity. Lots of encouraging factors. Number one, we see the law schools responding and adding programming and adding coursework and opportunities outside of classes for technology student groups to really dig into these issues while students are in law school, and they're coming to us prepared to respond and to help companies respond to incidents day one. It's wonderful to have lawyers arrive who know what incident response plans are, who know what tabletop exercises are. So we're getting there on the legal education. In terms of opportunity, I say today I'm a cyber lawyer, but a few years from now, all lawyers are going to be cyber lawyers. And the reality is that my practice right now, touches on a number of areas and requires me to coordinate with colleagues in our insurance practice, in our arbitration practice, in our intellectual property practice, in our tech transactions practice, in our white collar practice. So, very quickly, these issues are crossing, not just digital borders and boundaries. I thought Boyden said it well when she said it's not a regional issue, but across practice groups. I think cyber issues, digital issues, technology issues are really going to be at the forefront of every area in practice. So regardless of whether you're a litigator, regulatory attorney, a transactional attorney, there is opportunity, and you may not be able to avoid it. Not just opportunity, you may have to do it if you're coming into the profession. So, welcome all of those who are interested.
And Boyden, you may get the last word on this issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would love to have the last word on this issue, because here at CISA, we are trying very hard to be the best place to work in the federal government, and we've had director after director who has just made culture and retaining talent and recruiting it the forefront of their agendas. I'd like to introduce the audience to a term that Director Jen Easterly introduced to me and our whole workforce, which was living by the platinum rule. So no longer is it good enough to live by the golden rule. This is not about doing to others as you would have them do to you, but doing to others as they would like to be done unto. And I bring this up because for those of us who have reached a certain level of success in our career, clearly we have figured out a way to survive and thrive in the systems that we were raised in. We, as a former military person, I learned to raise through the ranks, even though, it's not, the majority of people are not, female identifying and stuff like that. So we have learned how to acclimate to our environment. But if you want to draw new people into this field, particularly people who add to our diversity, you cannot get complacent on pushing the envelope of your thinking about how you're actually meeting their needs. And I am confronted by this, every day in every leadership meeting where we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where I recognize that I am just, on my heels and not thinking as creatively and not thinking as empathetically as I need to be as a leader to draw and inspire the greatest talent to come to my organization and to stay, because that was not my lived experience. And so continually being empathetic and continually listening and drawing out what the workforce needs to succeed, I think is the most important thing that leaders can do to recruit and retain the best cyber talent for today's problems.
Thank you. I am thrilled and honored to have such amazing women to discuss these tricky issues with. And thank you so much for joining us today. So, dear panelists, I thank you and I look forward to continuing these important conversations with you. And now we're going to shift to Melissa Hathaway for her remarks. About 8 or 9 years ago, when I was thinking of leaving federal government, I took a train down to Washington, D.C. to meet with Melissa Hathaway, who was described as she is now, a global thought leader on critically important cybersecurity issues. And in that first meeting and conversation with Melissa over a somewhat subpar Indian barbecue or Indian buffet luncheon, but it was, we had, basically, I was too, probably the food was good, but I was too much in awe to even eat, because she described how all these different intersections of risk and data management and national security and governance all fit together. And it wasn't picking, but I knew securities law or I knew cyber crime issues. It was how this all had to be thought of holistically. And Melissa has been an advisor to two presidents. She was a cybersecurity policy review leader for President Barack Obama and led the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative for President George W. Bush. She has done global cybersecurity response, has been involved. She received the Intelligence Reform Medal, the National Intelligence Meritorious Unit Citation, and is a leader in advising both governments and private organizations as the president of Hathaway Global Strategies. So I'm honored to introduce you to Melissa as someone who has been instrumental to me in understanding and thinking about cybersecurity, and also has become a friend and is truly a brilliant mind on these issues. You have her bio. There's so much more we can say, but really I just want to hear from Melissa. So turning it to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. And it's just an honor to be here and part of this event with all of these amazing women. So I'm going to breeze through. I'm going to use a presentation. I'm hoping I'm going to wrap up what everybody has really talked about and have some visuals associated with it, and maybe talk about some other things if we get time for questions. But, we really have to think about, Secretary General Gutierrez is talking about that we have to reclaim this internet, this space as a public good. And there's a lot of lawlessness in cyberspace. It's threatening peace, stability, security of all of our countries. We're seeing the misuse of ICTs as a tool for cybercrime, for surveillance, enabling espionage, data exploitation, disinformation, and enabling digital authoritarianism. And so these are all a lot of different components that we need to be talking about when we get to digital risk. And that requires us to address our current digital risks and anticipate tomorrow's risks. And that requires a lot more informed and prepared leaders, which is why this program today that you're doing is so important. And that we need a lot more of these conversations, that we can have that interdisciplinary conversation about what needs to be done. When you look at it from a corporate perspective, there's only about 16% of our executives in the Fortune 500 who believe that they're prepared to deal with cyber risk. That's a lot of executives who are not prepared to deal with risk. And even fewer of those organizations have an incident response plan, and an incident response plan that includes a digital disaster, which is why it's so important that our corporations start to think about the future proofing of our infrastructures, our services, our corporations, that operational resilience, the business continuity, disaster recovery, the things that you have to in order to keep these critical services, infrastructures, corporations up has got to be top of mind. And that's why it's so important that Boyden talked about they're mapping the national critical functions. We've seen what it's like when you lose a massive critical function like oil and gas or water in Florida, or yesterday, the energy grid in Colorado. We have to actually start thinking about this differently and much more strategically. First, you have to think about, as corporations or institutions, even like NYU, that patching the hardware and the software is the single most important thing you can do, because your technology is hardly ever up to date. It comes with the principle of field it fast and fix it later. And that Patch Tuesday leads to a vulnerable Wednesday for all of our corporations, our critical services and infrastructures. Microsoft averages 1,000 vulnerabilities that they patch a year, Oracle over 1,500 a year. And every single vendor service that you have in your critical infrastructure, your key corporation, your enterprise, is got a patch cadence to it, and you have to keep up with that. When you start to think about unpatched systems, they're really easy to find. In fact, there's a free for service on the internet called Shodan, shodan.io, that I can go and look at anybody's architecture and see what's not patched. Just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, T-Mobile had a bad day. It was their 8th in a row in the last year or 6 years. And, an American hacker operating out of Turkey was able to find an unprotected router, most likely unpatched router, to get to 100 servers in the company's data center in Washington and get to 54 million records. That was a very large data breach. And all because of an unpatched system that I can get access to get to 100 servers and 54 million unencrypted records. That's a bad day for an unpatched system and for that corporation. You also start to see that you not only an unpatched system, but you can start to see that corporations do it to themselves. From a faulty configuration, as probably a software defined upgrade that wasn't properly tested. You had Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram knocked offline for 7 hours. Well, Facebook runs is the backbone of key countries like the Philippines or South Africa. Can you imagine what happens when you take 2.75 billion people offline because you didn't properly test your software, or you had inappropriate configuration and faulty configuration? It makes us start to think about what are our single points of failure or our single points of dependency as nations, as companies, and the like. And then we have the supply chain software problem that we've been talking about, the compromise of supply chains and the compromise of key critical software that we are dependent upon to run our businesses. We're at the anniversary, I think it's actually today, of the announcement that Mandiant had on the discovery that they had in their own enterprise of the software, the SolarWinds software that had been compromised by the Russian intelligence services. But what was really interesting is that SolarWinds is used by more than 400 of the Fortune 500 and is used by almost every US government agency and European government agency as a key network management software. When its product is compromised, then they have, and Russians or other countries have access to all of their third party or their primary suppliers. SolarWinds didn't take protecting its company infrastructure, protecting and securing its infrastructure as a priority, nor did it protect or secure its software development area, nor was it following implementing secure development lifecycle. So now it's starting to do those things, but we've learned a hard lesson when I can compromise a key supplier in the overall architecture to get access to all of the rest of the companies or organizations in the like. SolarWinds was not the only one to have a significant problem last year. Accellion had a vulnerability in its file transfer appliance that affected hundreds of companies around the world. Centrion is a very similar product to SolarWinds. It had vulnerabilities in its network monitoring software that led to full control, adversaries to take full control over other networks, and Storm Shield the same way. So we start to think about our ICT, these companies have to start to take the importance of their product in the market and ensuring the integrity of their product as it goes to market as a higher priority. It can no longer be a fix it, field it fast and fix it later. We have to have the ICT industry take a higher order of responsibility and accountability for their product in the market that is the core behind all of our critical infrastructures, services, and corporations. And as we've said in this panel prior, is that, ransomware is one of our biggest challenges. We've seen 180% increase on ransomware attacks over the last year. We've seen almost a 900% increase of double extortion, which was so well articulated by Michaela. And an average organization is offline for 19 days. Right now, the state of Maryland's health system is offline. Right now, Colorado, we have an energy grid offline. And right now in the UK, we have major shopping supermarkets that are offline, again, all because of ransomware attacks. Colonial Pipeline was an important wake-up call for the United States of America. When you have a company whose VPN can get access with credentials available on the dark web, and there's no multi-factor authentication in use, and there's no proper segmentation of the network, then you start to have oil and gas knocked offline for 6 days because I was able to access the IT systems and ransom them, as well as exfiltrate data. And I had access to the operational technology. We don't have operational resilience if a company like Colonial Pipeline can be ransomed by Russian hackers. And that could lead to a national economic crisis. We need our companies to do better and to really, again, assure the operational resilience and have basic hygiene and segmentation of their networks. We saw the same with JB Foods. JB Foods was also ransomed by Russian hackers that are on the OFAC list. And their manufacturing was ransomed, and it knocked the entire meat industry offline, from beef and pork, raised prices, and not only in our supermarkets, but all the restaurants, and a real supply chain lag. So now we have a test against our oil and gas. It can be knocked offline for at minimum 6 days. Now we have our food industry that can be knocked offline for many days. And you start to see the hiring of and the paying of these ransom operations, which leads to, I think, a continuation of a perpetuation of crime and fraud, et cetera, in the system. You recently also saw the ransomware media outlets. Sinclair Broadcasting took down 185 stations, channels in most of the US markets, again, because of a ransomware, again, by a Russian hacking group or criminal syndicate that is testing now media. So which is going to be the next thing that's going to be tested? We've seen our hospitals, we've seen our schools, we've seen our government institutions. It's really a significant challenge here in the United States and in many of other countries that we have to address. President Biden addressed some of this in his executive order that came out in May of 2021. Within that, it was mostly focused on the US government needs to get its hygiene in order. And we need to start to think about how can we get more of our companies to share information about incidents so we can get a better understanding of what's going on, that we need to have security standards for the software supply chain. We can't afford to have another SolarWinds episode or Centrion and all of these other companies that have their software compromised that leads to compromises of 18,000 companies and government agencies all around the world. We also talked about, and in this executive order talks about a software bill of materials. What are the ingredients behind your product? And is it using an open source libraries that we know have been compromised 20 years ago? And that you have to certify your software, sort of the SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, the attestation that you in fact can confirm and affirm your product's integrity. These are important things that are coming out of this executive order that are going to be under execution by CISA and Department of Commerce and other organizations. You've seen, and we heard about a lot of the ransomware guidance that came out of the White House and then came out of CISA and it came out of National Security Agency and more recently out of NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology. But New York DFS has issued guidance on ransomware also. And as a regulator, this I think has more teeth, where they talk about what you have to filter, the malicious attachments and links, that you really have to have a documented program on how you're going to identify, assess, track, and remediate vulnerabilities, that you must actually implement two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, disable remote desktop protocol, which is one of the key areas exploiting Microsoft and other products into your enterprise, implementing least privilege access and monitoring for suspicious activities. If you do, in fact, are going to be the victim of ransomware, you better have segregated backups and actually show what the mean time to restore your business continuity is. And then I just want to say that the administration is also taking steps on working with a transatlantic cooperation on technology standards, securing the supply chain. How do we maintain competitiveness in a very deep competitive environment with China? How do we start to think about data governance and tech platform regulations so that we can keep the flow of data across borders and that we don't get misaligned or out of sync between us and Europe? And that we really need to align how we're thinking about the misuse of technology threatening our security, the peace, stability of our countries. We saw this actually furthered in the Quad, Senior Quad Cyber Group talked about it also, which included India, Australia, and Japan. And thinking about how do we think again to shared standards that keep the free flow of goods, data, services, and capital across borders. How do we work together to get secure software? It cannot just be done in the United States through an executive order or through commerce's orders. It has to be done multilaterally, and so that we keep an interoperable international environment. That we need to think about how we're going to promote digital infrastructure that's trustworthy, because there's too much misuse of ICTs right now. And then how do we get ahead of tomorrow's problems, advancing the research for artificial intelligence, other new communications like 6G, beyond the 5G, and how do we think about quantum and other things? These are some of the things that we have to think about of getting ahead of tomorrow's problems today. We have to architect with resilience in mind, operational resilience, security, privacy, and safety. The speed of innovation is driving our exposure. It's our responsibility to start to think about digital risk management for the digital economy and our digital future. Thank you, Judy. It's been such an honor to be here today, and I look forward to any questions if we have any time.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm going to exhale because I was holding my breath that whole time because there was so much packed into that little bit of time of brilliance from you. So thank you. A lot to think about from our program today. Thank you so much. So Melissa, one question in terms of the importance of the multi-continent collaboration and some of the challenges of that in terms of lack of trust and lack of communication. Can you just speak a little bit more on some progress that's made or how the public sector here, the private sector here in the United States may be a partner in those conversations?
Well, I think that it's really important right now that you're seeing sort of two things that are happening based on the digital economy and competitiveness. You're seeing regions like Europe or countries like China that are really starting to look at how do they position their national champions, how do they position their marketplace. And so you're starting to see new regulation that is going to change the competitive landscape. You're seeing data localization requirements. new data protection and privacy requirements and scrutiny. So if you want to help the digital economy flourish, you have to start to think about smart regulation or limited regulation so that you can continue to keep the borders open for, again, the free flow of goods, services, data, and capital across borders. And right now, I think that you're seeing a mix of things that I think risk the interoperability or those data flows that have to be considered. I think there's also something that we have to get ahead of is, the Internet of Things and industrial Internet of Things. We're connecting 127 devices to the internet every second. And those devices are not secure and they're not resilient and they're probably not safe. And so you're seeing we have state laws here in the United States, California, Oregon, soon to be Virginia, and others that have set up laws on how you have to field your product and that it can't have a hard-coded admin password. You also have laws that are emerging in Germany, which will be Europe. You have one in Japan. You have another in Australia. So as we're trying to create interoperability or maintain interoperability among our countries, you can't have the laws say all these different things that I field a product in the United States or California that's X, it's got to be different for Japan, which is Y. It might have to be different even further for China. We have to start to think about that from a multilateral perspective to keep trade and interoperability among our countries. And then I think it's the same with artificial intelligence. You're seeing you had the Toronto communique that talked about, the key standards that we need to be thinking about. You have AI regulation emerging out of Europe. You can't use AI for HR or for other key things to make decisions. You have a regulation emerging in China and others, and so I can almost see that technology also kind of getting out of sync because of the different legal and regulatory regimes that are coming around and internationally that we're not collaborating or coordinating multilaterally.
And I know that in your firm, you do a lot of advising work for boards and you've served yourself on public company boards and other boards of directors and boards of advisors. This topic has been coming up quite a lot in terms of that intersection between board governance and oversight, not getting too much in the weeds, but making sure management's doing their job. Just a couple quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think that you have to have, digital risk has to be mainstreamed in enterprise risk, and we can no longer think about the digital risk or cybersecurity as just an IT job. It's not, it's everybody's job. And I think that the panel really articulated that. So technology risk has to be redefined into operational risk, into legal risk, reputational risk, financial risk. So if I'm running a manufacturing company that's running legacy hardware and software, then I'm 100% risk 100% of the time. And tomorrow could be our bad day until we do a capital refresh. And that needs to be communicated in the operational and financial terms. The same thing with the legal risk and the regulatory risk. There's a lot of companies that are multinational companies. It's very difficult to maintain currency in all of the different jurisdictions of which these multinationals operate. Again, that legal risk is going to change what the technology landscape is in that company and create new operational and financial risks that have to be articulated. And then finally, if you become the company that's targeted by Russia or China or, pick your country, you need to be prepared for you're the geopolitical pawn in the game. And then the question that the board needs to ask management is, how resilient are we? And what is our mean time to restore operations on our worst day? And if they can't answer that and it's not tested, then you're not actually an operationally resilient company, and you need to start to invest to become one.
Awesome advice. Thank you. Do you think that we'll see changes either in law or practice on incident reporting for the coming year and how that might be developing?
Well, there's certainly the TSA has extraordinary authorities that they're leveraging right now that they have, as a result of Colonial Pipeline, have given instructions to oil and gas. Yesterday it was aviation and rail. And I think that there's going to be continued reporting requirements. I think the question is that has to be asked as legislation is being considered on Capitol Hill and others is, what problem are we trying to solve? Because the incident reporting is not going to solve the problem. It's just going to give a little bit more transparency in how bad the situation is. And so if we're trying to get to operational resilience, the reporting is not necessarily going to make the difference. And so I challenge all of my government colleagues is make sure you're laser focused on the problem you're trying to solve, because some of these other things that we're forcing on companies or on our allies are actually increasing our costs, are creating friction and reducing interoperability. And they're having unintended consequences and not necessarily solving the problem.
Thank you so very much, Melissa. Cybersecurity issues are incredibly hard. And one of the reasons I love my job and what I do is that I get to work with brilliant women like you and Eun Young Choi this morning, and our panelists, Edna and Deneen and Michaela and Boyden. So I thank all of you for joining us today for a really terrific conversation. I also want to thank our sponsors and also the team at NYU for the Center of Cybersecurity and also the Masters in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy for just the terrific support in helping make these programs happen. So thank you again, Melissa. Thank you, team. And thank you, dear audience, for joining us today. Until next time, thank you.